Flight attendant Shea Carter kicks Black millionaire family off a plane. 7 minutes later, they own the airline. What happens when an unfair act ignites an unexpected transformation? This shocking story follows a Black millionaire family humiliated by a flight attendant, only to turn the tables in a way no one could have predicted. They go from passengers to owners of the airline itself. If this sounds intriguing, we'd love to hear your thoughts. After watching, hit 1 if you're inspired or 0 if not. Your feedback motivates us to bring you more impactful stories. Shea Carter had been a flight attendant for nearly 15 years, working for Ambrosia Airways, a prestigious airline known for its luxury. She had handled it all, demanding passengers, last-minute chaos, and endless delays. Shea's reputation was built on her unshakable professionalism, and she considered her job more than a career. It was a lifestyle. Ambrosia Airways prided itself on an elite flying experience, and Shea was seen as an integral part of maintaining this image. She was used to ensuring first-class passengers felt like royalty, no matter how demanding they might be. That evening, Shea prepared for Flight 207, bound for Valencia. As passengers began boarding, she stood at the gate, her practiced gaze scanning the crowd. Her sharp intuition helped her identify potential troublemakers or passengers who might need extra attention. Her job was to ensure that nothing disrupted the exclusivity of first class. Among the crowd, her eyes landed on a family that immediately caught her attention. A man in a tailored navy suit, a woman in a modest yet elegant dress, and their 2 quiet, well-behaved children stood calmly in line. They didn't flaunt wealth, yet something about them unsettled Shea. They looked like a typical family who could afford first-class tickets, but her instincts told her otherwise. As they approached, Shea scrutinized their boarding passes, noting they were indeed first-class tickets. Yet a vague feeling of doubt lingered. It wasn't their attire. They were impeccably dressed. It wasn't even the polite way they addressed her. It was something Shea couldn't quite name, but it made her uneasy. "Excuse me," Shea said as they reached the gate, signaling for them to step aside. The man, Marcus Bell, looked her directly in the eye, his tone calm yet firm. "Is there an issue?" "There seems to be some confusion," Shea replied, forcing a tight smile. "I need to verify your reservation." She knew the system had already confirmed their tickets as valid, but her instincts insisted otherwise. Shea stepped away to consult her supervisor, leaving Marcus and his wife Alana exchanging quiet but wary glances. The seconds stretched into minutes, and murmurs began rippling through the line of passengers waiting to board. Some whispered about the delay. Others openly glanced at the bells with curiosity or discomfort. When Shea returned, her demeanor was frostier than before. "Follow me," she said curtly. Instead of leading them to their assigned first-class seats, she directed them to a row at the back, near the restrooms. Her actions sent a clear message. She didn't believe they belonged in first class. Marcus stayed silent, his jaw tight, while Alana squeezed their children's hands gently, her calm exterior masking the storm brewing inside. The family quietly complied, moving to their assigned seats, their dignity intact despite the humiliating slight. As the bells settled into their new seats, Shea resumed her duties, but her unease lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that something about this family was different, and her actions, however subtle, had sparked something she couldn't yet foresee. The quiet tension in the air was just the beginning of a story that would shake Ambrosia Airways to its core. The flight began, and the plane climbed smoothly into the night sky. Sheila continued her routine, greeting passengers, offering refreshments, and ensuring everyone's needs were met. Yet, she couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in the back of her mind. Something about the Bell family unsettled her in a way she couldn't articulate. They weren't doing anything unusual, and yet their mere presence seemed to challenge her carefully curated authority in the cabin. As the flight progressed, Sheila found herself glancing toward the Bell family more often than she realized. Marcus sat quietly, engrossed in a book, while Alana helped one child color in a travel activity book. The younger child had dozed off, her small head resting against her mother's shoulder. They weren't disruptive or demanding. In fact, they seemed far more composed than many of the first-class passengers Sheila had served in the past. Yet, an inexplicable irritation bubbled beneath the surface. Retreating to the galley, Sheila found her colleague Dana setting up a tray of drinks. Dana, new to Ambrosia Airways, was eager to learn and quick to assist. "Everything okay out there?" Dana asked, her hands carefully arranging champagne flutes. Sheila hesitated before deciding to share what was on her mind. "Did you see the family sitting in the last row of first class?" she asked, lowering her voice. Dana glanced toward the section and nodded. "Yeah, they seem nice. Why?" Sheila leaned in, her tone sharpening. "Doesn't it feel off? First class isn't cheap, and they're just, well, you know." Dana frowned slightly, unsure how to respond. "Their tickets are valid, aren't they?" "Of course," Sheila replied, rolling her eyes. "But that doesn't mean much these days. People find ways to cheat the system. I've seen it before." Dana didn't argue, but her unease was clear. Sheila's words lingered in the air, further fueling her internal frustration. Convinced her instincts were correct, Sheila doubled down, keeping an even closer eye on the Bell family. She scrutinized their every move, waiting for some behavior that might justify her unease. Meanwhile, Marcus and Alana were acutely aware of the tension surrounding them. Alana, always perceptive, noticed that their service was conspicuously slow. Other passengers were served their drinks and snacks promptly, but their row was conspicuously overlooked. When they pressed the call button to request water for their youngest daughter, the response was unusually delayed. Alana chose to stay silent, but Marcus leaned closer to her and whispered, "They're watching us." Alana gave him a small, calm nod. "Let them," she whispered back. "We've faced worse." Marcus sighed, his frustration palpable but contained. He pulled out his phone and briefly checked his emails before setting it aside. He didn't want to make a scene, but couldn't deny the growing irritation at how they were being treated. What was meant to be a celebratory trip was beginning to feel like a test of patience. Unbeknownst to Sheila, her actions and demeanor were being quietly noted, not just by the Bell family, but by others in the cabin who had begun to sense the tension. Something about her behavior wasn't sitting well with the passengers who prided themselves on being discerning observers. While Marcus and Alana remained composed, the undercurrent of unease in the first-class cabin was undeniable. Unbeknownst to Sheila, another first-class passenger had been closely observing her actions. A middle-aged man in an impeccably tailored suit, seated a few rows ahead of the Bells, had noticed the unusual delays in their service and the barely concealed irritation in Sheila's demeanor each time she passed their row. He raised a single eyebrow at the spectacle, but opted to remain silent, at least for the moment. As the flight progressed, the tension in the cabin grew palpable. Sheila tried to refocus on her duties, but her attention repeatedly drifted toward the Bell family. Something about their calm demeanor felt like a challenge to her authority, and it unsettled her in ways she couldn't define. For the first time in years, her carefully cultivated sense of control felt shaky, and she didn't like it one bit. When dinner service began, Sheila continued her calculated neglect. While the other first-class passengers enjoyed their gourmet meals, sipped fine wines, and chatted softly, Marcus and Alana Bell waited, their menus untouched on the tray table. Alana discreetly observed the efficient and warm service being offered to the other passengers. With a slight lean toward her husband, she whispered, "This isn't a coincidence." Marcus sighed, his arms crossing as he leaned back in his seat. "I know," he replied in a measured, calm voice that betrayed his frustration. "But let's not give her the satisfaction of seeing us upset." Eventually, Sheila approached their row, her expression carefully neutral, though her body language remained stiff. "I apologize for the delay," she said curtly, placing their menus down with a sharpness that was impossible to miss. "We've had a bit of a backlog in the galley. Can I take your order now?" Alana, ever composed, offered a polite smile. "Yes, of course," she said, her tone steady and unwavering. She and Marcus placed their orders with the same calm composure they had maintained all evening. Sheila quickly noted their choices and walked away without the warmth or professionalism she typically reserved for other passengers. As the meal service dragged on, Sheila's behavior did not escape the notice of the man in the sharp suit. While he sipped his whiskey quietly, he continued to observe the Bells and the clear lack of attentiveness directed toward them. His expression betrayed growing displeasure as he weighed whether or not to speak up. Finally, The Bell's meals arrived, but not until after every other first-class passenger had been served. The delay was conspicuous, yet Alana maintained her grace, cutting into her meal with quiet poise. Marcus, appreciating her strength, offered her a small smile. Their children, perhaps sensing the tension in their parents' demeanor, remained silent, their behavior as composed as ever. Midway through the meal, the man in the sharp suit decided he could no longer remain silent. He flagged down Dana, who happened to be passing by. "Excuse me," he said in a low but firm tone. "Can I ask why the family in the last row of first class was served so late?" "It's not hard to notice." Dana froze, her eyes darting toward Sheila, who stood a few feet away. Sheila turned toward the man, her face tightening. "I assure you, sir, everything is under control," she said quickly, her tone clipped as she tried to deflect the question. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Under control?" he repeated, his voice steady but pointed. "It looks to me like there's a deliberate effort being made to ignore them. Do you think that's appropriate treatment for passengers who paid for first-class service?" Sheila's cheeks flushed slightly, but she forced a professional smile. "I'm sorry," she began. However, the man's words had already drawn the attention of others in the cabin, and the tension Sheila had tried to dismiss was now impossible to ignore. "If it seemed that way, sir, it wasn't intentional," Sheila said, her professional tone barely masking her discomfort. The man in the sharp suit regarded her for another moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a small shake of his head, he turned back to his meal, leaving Sheila feeling more unsettled than ever. Dana, clearly uneasy, excused herself from the situation and slipped back into the galley. Sheila, trying to regain her composure, stole another glance at the Bell family. They weren't causing a scene, nor were they complaining. Yet their calm and collected demeanor felt like an unspoken challenge, a quiet reprimand that Sheila wasn't prepared to confront. For the first time that evening, she felt a twinge of doubt creeping in. Something about this situation felt far larger and more significant than she had initially perceived, though she couldn't quite pinpoint why. The remainder of the dinner service appeared uneventful on the surface, but the tension lingered like a heavy cloud in the cabin. Sheila busied herself attending to other passengers, but her thoughts kept circling back to the sharp-suited man's comment and the Bell family's unwavering composure. Every interaction with them, no matter how routine, seemed to rattle her. They weren't confrontational, but their silence carried a weight that spoke volumes. In the Bell family's row, Marcus exchanged a look with Alana, silently acknowledging the growing unease in the cabin. Alana, ever the steadying force, leaned closer to her husband and whispered, "We've faced worse. Let's just enjoy what we can." Her hand lightly brushed his arm, a small gesture of reassurance. Marcus nodded, though his clenched jaw betrayed his lingering frustration. From her station near the galley, Sheila caught snippets of hushed conversations among the passengers. While no one openly criticized her, the man's earlier remark had clearly sparked quiet discussions. Sheila could feel her grip on the cabin's atmosphere slipping, and with it came a rare sense of unease. She prided herself on her professionalism and authority, yet this family had unsettled her in a way she couldn't rationalize. As the hours dragged on and the cabin lights dimmed for the night, most passengers settled in, some dozing off, others watching in-flight entertainment. The Bell children had fallen asleep, their small heads resting peacefully on their parents' shoulders. Marcus and Alana, however, remained quietly alert, their soft conversations punctuated by occasional glances toward the galley. Sheila's frustrations bubbled over as she turned to Dana and muttered under her breath, "I don't get why they're acting so entitled. It's not like they're royalty." Dana, clearly uncomfortable, hesitated before responding. "I don't think they're acting entitled," she said cautiously. "They seem like regular passengers. Maybe we should just treat them like everyone else." Sheila shot Dana a sharp look. "You don't understand," she said bitterly. "I've been doing this long enough to know when something feels off." She didn't elaborate, but her tone left little room for debate. Dana opened her mouth to reply but thought better of it and returned to the cabin, leaving Sheila alone with her simmering frustration. Meanwhile, Marcus quietly rose from his seat and made his way to the front of the plane. His demeanor remained calm, but there was a subtle intensity in his actions. He approached the captain's assistant and spoke briefly, his voice low but firm. The assistant nodded and led him to the cockpit, where Marcus engaged in a private conversation with the captain. When Marcus returned to his seat, Alana raised an eyebrow in silent inquiry. He offered her a reassuring glance, and she didn't press him for details. Alana trusted her husband's judgment and knew that whatever he had set in motion would be handled with the same quiet dignity they had maintained throughout the flight. Sheila, unaware of the quiet but significant conversation happening in the cockpit, continued with her rounds. Most of the first-class passengers appeared relaxed, sipping drinks or watching movies, but there was an undercurrent of subtle shifts in attention. Some passengers began noticing how Sheila bristled each time she neared the Bell family. Whispers traveled through the cabin, quiet but persistent, yet no one openly confronted her. As the plane glided through the darkened sky, cracks began to show in Sheila's meticulously maintained professionalism. Her confidence wavered, gnawed at by an unshakable feeling that she had underestimated the Bells. The question of why they unsettled her so much refused to leave her mind, distracting her from her duties. Meanwhile, Marcus and Alana remained calm, quietly watching the events unfold. Their stillness, poised and deliberate, felt like a mirror reflecting Sheila's own discomfort, and it unnerved her. The Bells did nothing to demand attention, nor did they raise their voices. Yet each glance Sheila cast their way only heightened her unease. The family's composed demeanor felt like a quiet but powerful challenge she couldn't ignore. While most passengers drifted into sleep or became absorbed in in-flight entertainment, the air in the cabin remained heavy with an invisible weight. In their row, Marcus adjusted his seat slightly and leaned closer to Alana. "Everything's ready," he whispered. Alana met his eyes, her expression unreadable, before giving him a small, measured nod. She glanced down at their children, still fast asleep, then back at Marcus. "Are you sure this is necessary?" she asked softly. Marcus offered a faint smile, one filled with quiet determination. "It's not about us anymore," he said. "It's about everyone who might face this." Alana held his gaze for a moment, absorbing the meaning of his words. Then she leaned back into her seat, resting a protective hand over their youngest daughter. Her calm exterior belied the storm of emotions she kept in check. Meanwhile, in the galley, Sheila found herself struggling with an unfamiliar sense of doubt. She had always trusted her instincts, relied on them to navigate countless flights and passengers. But tonight was different. Her thoughts were muddled, caught in a haze of frustration and confusion. Why did this family, who had done nothing disruptive, feel like such a challenge to her authority? Sheila convinced herself it was their quiet defiance that grated on her. Marcus's calm demeanor and Alana's grace felt, in some unspoken way, like an affront to the order she worked so hard to maintain. Yet she couldn't explain why this family in particular had drawn her ire. As she filled out a routine report near the galley, the man in the sharp suit, the same one who had earlier questioned her treatment of the Bells, approached her again. His glass of whiskey hung loosely in his hand, his expression composed but piercing. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice low enough not to wake the sleeping passengers. Sheila straightened, bracing herself. "Yes, sir? Is there something I can help you with?" she asked, her tone clipped but polite. The man tilted his head slightly, studying her. "You've worked for Ambrosia Airways a long time, haven't you?" "Yes, I have," Sheila replied, keeping her voice neutral but curt. 15 years. Why do you ask?" The man smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Impressive," he said. "Then, you must understand how important customer experience is to this airline. I assume the family in the last row of first class paid the same premium price as the rest of us. Wouldn't you agree they deserve the same service?" Sheila's jaw tightened, and her professional facade cracked slightly. She despised the way his words seemed to cut right to the heart of the matter. "Of course, sir," Sheila replied, forcing her tone to remain polite. "All passengers are treated with equal care." "Are they?" the man asked, raising an eyebrow. "Because it doesn't look that way from where I'm sitting." Sheila's grip tightened around her clipboard, the edges digging into her palms. "If there's a concern, I assure you it will be addressed," she said, her voice clipped. The man took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes fixed on hers. "Good," he said evenly, his tone calm but loaded with meaning. "Because you never know who might be watching." With that, he turned and walked back to his seat, leaving Sheila standing in the galley, a growing sense of dread settling over her. The cryptic remark reverberated in her mind, and for a moment she felt as though she had just been cautioned, though she couldn't quite figure out why. Did he know the Bell family personally? Were they someone important? Sheila shook her head, trying to dismiss the thoughts. She'd handled countless difficult passengers in the past. She could handle this too. And yet, deep down, she couldn't ignore the unease gnawing at her. This flight felt different. It felt like she wasn't the one in control. As the hours wore on, Sheila's nerves began to fray. Every glance toward the Bell family unsettled her further. Their calm, unruffled demeanor only magnified the tension within her. They seemed so composed, so unaffected by the thinly veiled hostility she had shown them. It was as though they knew something she didn't, and their quiet confidence gnawed at her. The man's cryptic words from the galley echoed in her mind. You never know who might be watching. What had he meant? Why had he chosen to direct those words at her? As the plane began its gradual descent toward Valencia, Sheila struggled to focus on her duties. She moved through the aisles, collecting trash, assisting passengers, and preparing the cabin for landing. Yet, no matter how much she busied herself, her gaze kept drifting to the last row of first class. Marcus and Alana had woken their children, who now stared out the window, captivated by the sparkling city lights below. Alana adjusted her daughter's blanket while Marcus checked his phone, his expression as calm and measured as ever. In the back of her mind, Sheila couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. It wasn't just the Bell's quiet presence. It was the way other passengers occasionally glanced their way, whispering amongst themselves. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted, and Sheila felt as though she was standing on the precipice of something beyond her control. As the plane touched down on the tarmac, the first-class passengers began gathering their belongings, preparing to disembark. Sheila noticed Marcus slip his phone into his pocket before exchanging a glance with Alana. The look between them was brief but deliberate, as if they had silently agreed on their next steps. Sheila busied herself with her tasks, ensuring the other passengers were ready to leave, but her ears remained attuned to any movement from the Bells. Finally, the cabin doors opened, and Sheila moved toward the exit to bid farewell to the first-class passengers, her professional smile firmly in place. One by one, the passengers filed out, thanking Sheila and the rest of the crew for their service. The man in the sharp suit passed her, giving her a long, pointed look but saying nothing. The weight of his gaze lingered even after he walked away. When it was the Bell's turn, Sheila stiffened slightly. Marcus paused and looked directly at her. "Thank you for the flight," he said, his tone polite and measured, but with an underlying strength that made Sheila's stomach tighten. Alana followed with a similarly courteous nod, her gaze steady and unreadable. "You're welcome," Sheila said quickly, eager for the Bell family to move on. As they exited, Marcus turned briefly to glance back at the cabin. His expression was thoughtful, but Sheila couldn't tell if it was a gesture of farewell or something else entirely. The look left her feeling oddly vulnerable, as though the thin layer of control she had clung to throughout the flight had been silently peeled away. Moments after the last first-class passenger disembarked, another flight attendant approached Sheila with a puzzled expression. "The captain wants to see you in the cockpit," she said in a hushed tone. Sheila's heart skipped a beat. "What for?" she asked, trying to maintain her composure. "I don't know," the attendant replied with a shrug, "but he said it was urgent." A jolt of panic coursed through Sheila, though she quickly masked it with a practiced calm. Adjusting her uniform, she took a deep breath and headed toward the cockpit. She told herself it was probably a routine matter, something minor that would be resolved quickly. But as she walked through the now empty first-class cabin, a nagging feeling gnawed at her. This had to be about the Bell family, and whatever awaited her in the cockpit felt like it might change everything. Sheila stepped into the cockpit, the steady hum of the plane's systems filling the small space. Captain Holden, a composed and seasoned pilot, sat with the co-pilot, both reviewing the final landing procedures. When Sheila entered, Captain Holden looked up, his expression unreadable. "You wanted to see me, Captain?" Sheila asked, her voice steady despite the thudding of her heart. She clasped her hands in front of her, her demeanor polished and professional. Captain Holden nodded toward the empty jump seat. "Take a seat, Sheila." Her heart pounded as she complied, glancing nervously between the two men. "Is something wrong?" she asked. The captain exhaled deeply, folding his hands on the console in front of him. "We've received a message from corporate," he began, his tone calm but firm. "It concerns the passengers in row 1G and 1H. Sheila's stomach dropped, her mind raced. What message? Why now? She had handled the situation discreetly, or so she thought. "The Bell family," Captain Holden clarified, his eyes watching her reaction closely. "They're not just passengers, Sheila. They're owners." Sheila blinked, her mind struggling to process his words. "Owners?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Captain Holden said, his tone sharpening slightly. "Marcus and Alana Bell are the majority stakeholders in Ambrosia Airways. They recently acquired the company as part of their broader investment portfolio. This flight was one of their first incognito evaluations of staff performance." Sheila's breath caught, her thoughts spiraling as the weight of his words hit her. Owners. The very family she had subtly mistreated and dismissed throughout the flight didn't just buy first-class tickets. They owned the airline. A cold sweat broke out on her brow as the implications of her actions settled over her. Every delay, every slight, every dismissive glance, it had all been noticed. Not just by the Bells, but likely by the other passengers as well. "Captain, I wasn't aware," Sheila stammered, her voice shaky. "That's the problem," Holden interrupted, his tone cutting. "You weren't aware because you didn't bother to treat them with the same respect you showed the other passengers. And now, I'm afraid, the situation is out of my hands. The Bells have requested a meeting with you before they leave the airport." Sheila's hands gripped the armrests of the seat, her knuckles white. "A meeting?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Captain, surely—" "It's not a request," Holden said firmly, cutting her off. "It's a directive from corporate. I suggest you prepare yourself to explain your actions." Sheila sat frozen, her mind spinning. A meeting with the owners, the very people she had disrespected, judged, and dismissed without a second thought. The foundation of her confidence and authority felt like it was crumbling beneath her. She opened her mouth to protest, but quickly realized it would be futile. The control she thought she had was gone. Captain Holden stood, signaling that their conversation was over. "They're waiting in the VIP lounge," he said. "I'll escort you there personally. Let's get this over with." Sheila rose slowly, her legs trembling beneath her. As she followed the captain out of the cockpit, the reality of the situation fully hit her. This wasn't a simple reprimand. It was the kind of moment that could end her career. Worse, she had no one to blame but herself. Walking down the jet bridge, Sheila's heart pounded with every step. The harsh fluorescent lights above cast stark shadows, mirroring the dread pooling in her chest. She struggled to maintain her composure, but the whispers of the cabin crew, who had clearly caught wind of the situation, only deepened her discomfort. When they reached the VIP lounge, the glass doors slid open with a soft hiss. Sheila's eyes immediately landed on Marcus and Alana Bell. The couple sat in plush armchairs, exuding an air of quiet authority. Marcus was relaxed, one leg crossed over the other, with an arm draped casually over the chair. Alana sat upright, her posture both graceful and commanding. Her expression was unreadable. Their children were absent, likely being attended to elsewhere, leaving the Bells fully focused on what was about to unfold. Captain Holden gestured for Sheila to step inside. For a moment, she remained frozen in place, the weight of the moment rooting her to the spot. "Go ahead," the captain said firmly, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. Sheila finally stepped forward, the sound of her polished heels clicking against the marble floor echoing in the quiet room. The air of confidence she usually wore like armor had completely evaporated, replaced by a suffocating sense of vulnerability. She was about to face the very people she had underestimated, and suddenly she was acutely aware of how small and powerless she felt. Marcus glanced up, his expression calm but piercing. He nodded toward the chair across from him. "Have a seat," he said simply. Sheila obeyed, lowering herself into the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to keep them from trembling. Alana leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering and intense. "Sheila, is it?" she asked, her tone cool but polite. "Yes, ma'am," Sheila replied, her voice barely audible. A flush of humiliation crept up her neck, but she forced herself to meet Alana's eyes. Marcus exchanged a brief glance with Alana before turning his attention back to Sheila. "I'd like to start by asking you a simple question," he said, his voice measured. "Why do you think we're here?" Sheila hesitated, her throat tightening. She wanted to deflect, to shift the conversation away from her actions, but she knew there was no escape. She began, her voice faltering. "I understand there were issues during the flight." Marcus raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to elaborate. Sheila fidgeted with the hem of her blazer, the words catching in her throat. "I may have mishandled certain aspects of your service," she admitted, each word feeling like a jagged stone she was forced to swallow. "Mishandled," Alana repeated, her tone laced with incredulity. She exchanged another look with Marcus, who exhaled deeply and leaned forward. "Sheila," he said softly, but his voice carried a weight that made her flinch slightly. "This isn't about a delayed drink order or a less-than-ideal seat assignment," Marcus began, his voice calm but firm. "This is about respect, or more accurately, the lack of it. Throughout the entire flight, you treated us as though we didn't belong. Am I wrong?" Sheila opened her mouth, instinctively wanting to deny it, but she stopped herself. Lying was pointless. They had seen through her actions, just as she had feared. "No, sir," she admitted quietly. "You're not wrong." Alana tilted her head slightly, her expression shifting from stern to something closer to disappointment. "Do you know how many times we've encountered this kind of treatment?" she asked, her voice steady but cutting. "We've worked hard to build a life where we don't have to justify our presence. But people like you still make us feel as though we're trespassing. Why is that?" Sheila's throat tightened. She couldn't summon a response. Alana's words struck harder than she'd expected, forcing her to confront the unspoken biases she had hidden beneath years of polished professionalism. Marcus leaned back, his gaze unwavering. "This isn't just about us," he continued. "It's about every passenger who has ever been made to feel less than because of someone else's prejudice. As owners, we have a responsibility to ensure that this kind of behavior doesn't exist on our airline. And after today, I'm not sure you belong here." Sheila's eyes widened, panic rising in her chest. "Mr. Bell, please," she stammered. "This was a mistake, a lapse in judgment. I've been with Ambrosia Airways for 15 years. I'm good at my job. I can learn from this." Marcus studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Alana, however, was less restrained. "You've been here for 15 years?" she said sharply, her tone cutting through the room. "And what have you learned in that time?" "Clearly not how to treat people with respect." Sheila's heart sank further. The silence that followed was deafening. She realized with devastating clarity that no carefully chosen words or excuses could undo the damage she had caused. The control she had clung to so tightly during the flight was gone, replaced by an unshakable truth. She had misjudged them, and now she was facing the consequences. After a long pause, Marcus finally spoke. "We'll take this matter to corporate," he said calmly. "Your actions today will be reviewed, and a decision will be made about your future with Ambrosia Airways. But understand this, your behavior is unacceptable, and it reflects poorly, not just on you, but on the entire company. That's something we cannot ignore." Sheila nodded, her hands trembling in her lap. She wanted to plead further, to defend herself, but she knew it would only make things worse. Instead, she sat in silence, the weight of their words pressing down on her as the reality of her actions settled over her like a heavy fog. Sitting frozen in her chair, Sheila felt the gravity of the situation bearing down on her. Marcus and Alana's words dismantled every fragile justification she had clung to throughout the flight. It was as though every unspoken thought, every subtle bias she had acted upon, was laid bare for the world to see. For the first time in her 15 years with Ambrosia Airways, Sheila felt utterly powerless. Marcus leaned forward again, his calm demeanor steady. "Sheila," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made her flinch slightly. "We're not here to humiliate you. This isn't about revenge or making a spectacle of what happened. This is about accountability." Sheila nodded stiffly, unsure of how to respond. Her throat felt dry, and her mind scrambled for anything that could salvage her position. She began, her voice cracking. She cleared her throat and tried again. I understand that my actions were inappropriate, and I'm deeply sorry for how I treated you and your family, Sheila said, her voice trembling with sincerity. Alana's gaze remained steady, her expression unreadable. Sorry isn't enough, Sheila, she said firmly. Apologies don't undo the harm caused. What matters is what you choose to do moving forward. Words are easy, change isn't. Sheila swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the hem of her blazer. She wanted to protest, to explain that she wasn't the person they believed her to be, but deep down, she knew there was truth in Alana's words. She had allowed her biases to dictate her actions, and now she was facing the consequences. Marcus leaned back slightly, his tone softening but retaining its firmness. Here's what's going to happen, he began. Alana and I will be reporting this incident to corporate. They will decide the next steps. Whether or not you remain with Ambrosia Airways is out of our hands. But know this, your behavior tonight has set a standard we cannot ignore. Sheila nodded mutely, her chest hollow with regret. She had spent years building her career, climbing the ranks and priding herself on her professionalism. And yet, all of it had unraveled in a single flight. The silence that stretched between them felt unbearable, but the bells didn't rush to fill it. Their composed, deliberate presence only amplified the weight of her guilt. Finally, Alana stood, adjusting her coat with a quiet grace that deepened Sheila's shame. We've said what we needed to, Alana said, her voice cool and resolute. What happens next is up to you, Sheila. Think carefully about how you carry this forward. Marcus rose as well, extending a hand toward Sheila. She hesitated, then reached out to shake it. His grip was firm but measured. Good luck, he said simply, his tone devoid of malice but filled with finality. As the bells walked out of the lounge, Sheila sat motionless, her mind a whirlwind of regret and self-recrimination. The echoes of their footsteps faded, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the stark, cold truth. Her own actions had brought her to this point. There was no one else to blame. Moments later, Captain Holden re-entered the lounge, his expression a mixture of professionalism and quiet pity. Sheila, he said evenly, corporate will contact you in the morning. For now, I suggest you take the rest of the week to reflect on this. Sheila nodded silently and rose to her feet, her legs heavy and unsteady. As she left the lounge, the weight of the situation pressed down on her with full force. Her career, her reputation, everything she had worked so hard for, was now hanging by a thread, and all because she had let her prejudices cloud her judgment. The carefully constructed world she had built for herself felt suddenly fragile, teetering on the brink of collapse. Walking through the bustling airport terminal, Sheila's steps felt leaden. The usual noise, the hum of travelers reuniting, professionals rushing to their gates, announcements echoing overhead, felt distant, like static in the background of her spiraling thoughts. The bell's words replayed in her mind over and over, each one cutting deeper than the last. Their calm, deliberate confrontation weighed more heavily than any shouting match ever could. She reached the employee parking lot and climbed into her car, gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. For a long moment, she simply sat there, staring blankly at the dashboard, her mind a chaotic storm of regret. The Bells' faces floated in her memory, calm, composed, yet filled with quiet disappointment. Sheila wanted to feel angry, to blame them for her predicament, but she couldn't. She knew, in her heart, that every choice she had made during that flight had led her here. The drive home was a blur. The city lights streaked past her windows like faint, fleeting memories, and the weight of her decisions settled heavier with every passing moment. Sheila barely noticed the turns on her drive home, her body moving on autopilot while her mind spiraled deeper into self-reflection. It wasn't just about this one incident, she realized. There had been other moments, smaller ones, that she had brushed aside or justified, where her actions might have been influenced by biases she refused to acknowledge. The Bells had simply been the first to call her out so openly, forcing her to confront what she had ignored for years. When she finally pulled into her driveway, her home seemed colder and emptier than usual. Sheila sat in her car for a long moment, unable to bring herself to go inside. She knew the silence of her home would only amplify the storm raging in her mind. Eventually, she gathered herself, stepping out of the car. Her heels clicked softly on the hardwood floor as she walked in, dropped her bag by the door, and collapsed onto the couch, staring blankly at the ceiling. The reality of her situation began to settle over her when her phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling her from her daze. She hesitated before picking it up, dread tightening in her chest. It was an email from Ambrosia Airways corporate office. The subject line read, "Immediate review of employee conduct, Sheila Carter." Her stomach clenched as she opened the email. The message was brief but unambiguous. It confirmed that Marcus and Alana Bell had filed an official report outlining the steps that would follow. A meeting with HR, a formal review of her behavior during the flight, and a temporary suspension pending the outcome. There was no mention of termination, but the possibility loomed heavily in the spaces between the lines. Sheila set the phone down with trembling hands, her mind racing. 15 years of dedication, carefully building her reputation, perfecting her craft. All of it was on the verge of collapse. Yet deep down, a small voice whispered that this wasn't just about her job. It was about something much larger, something she had avoided confronting for too long. Leaning forward, Sheila buried her face in her hands. She had spent years believing she was above reproach, that her professionalism insulated her from the consequences of her biases. But the bells had shattered that illusion with quiet precision, forcing her to see herself in a way she never had before. For the first time, she felt completely untethered, unsure of how to move forward. The next morning, Sheila woke early after a restless sleep filled with fragmented dreams of the flight. The email from corporate was the first thing on her mind as she opened her eyes, a heavy reminder of the challenges ahead. As she sipped her coffee, she stared at the email again on her phone. Part of her clung to the hope that it was all a misunderstanding that would somehow resolve itself. But deep down, she knew better. Sheila spent the morning replaying every interaction with the bells, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when everything went wrong. But the harder she searched for a single instance, the more she realized the truth. It wasn't just one moment. It was a series of choices, subtle and deliberate, born from prejudices she hadn't been willing to admit. She had never thought of herself as someone who discriminated, but her actions spoke louder than her intentions ever could. As the hours passed, her fear of losing her job began to mix with something deeper. Shame. Sheila wasn't just afraid of the consequences. She was starting to see how profoundly her behavior had betrayed the values she believed she upheld. She remembered Alana's sharp words in the lounge. "What have you learned in 15 years?" The question haunted her, a stinging reminder that her professionalism had been nothing more than a hollow facade. When it was time for her meeting with HR, Sheila dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that projected competence and seriousness. But as she stared at her reflection in the mirror, she couldn't shake the feeling that her polished exterior was no longer enough to shield her from the truth of her actions. As Sheila drove to the Ambrosia Airways headquarters, the city felt unusually cold and gray, mirroring the dread settling in her chest. The journey stretched endlessly, and by the time she arrived, she felt almost numb. At the front desk, the receptionist directed Sheila to a small conference room where a representative from HR and a senior manager were waiting. Her heart raced as she stepped inside, but she forced herself to keep a neutral expression. The manager, a no-nonsense woman named Evelyn Drake, gestured for Sheila to sit. "We're here to address the incident on Flight 207, Evelyn began, her tone professional but firm. "The Bells, as majority stakeholders, have filed a formal complaint regarding your conduct. They've detailed specific concerns about how you handled their service." Sheila nodded, her throat dry. She wanted to defend herself, but Evelyn held up a hand, stopping her. "We'll give you an opportunity to respond," Evelyn continued. "But first, let me be clear. This is not a minor issue. The Bells' complaint isn't just about poor service. It's about behavior that reflects systemic bias. That's something we take very seriously at Ambrosia." The HR representative, a younger man who seemed more uncomfortable than upset, nodded in agreement. "This isn't just about the Bells as individuals," he added. "They've raised concerns about how this could impact the company's reputation and culture." Sheila swallowed hard, feeling the weight of their words. This wasn't just about her anymore. Her actions had cast a shadow over the entire airline, a brand built on the promise of luxury and inclusivity. When Evelyn gestured for Sheila to speak, she took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. "I understand the seriousness of the situation," she began carefully, "and I take full responsibility for my actions on that flight. I didn't treat Mr. and Mrs. Bell with the respect they deserved. I allowed my own assumptions to affect my behavior." Her admission hung in the air. For a brief moment, the room was silent. Sheila felt a flicker of hope that her honesty might count for something, but Evelyn's expression didn't soften. "What assumptions are you referring to?" Evelyn asked sharply, leaning forward slightly. Sheila hesitated. She knew the answer, but saying it aloud felt like stepping into a void. Finally, she spoke, her voice almost breaking. "I assumed they didn't belong in first class," she admitted quietly. "I let that assumption influence how I treated them." Evelyn's gaze remained steady. "Do you understand why that's unacceptable? Not just on a personal level, but as a representative of this company?" "Yes," Sheila said quickly. "I do, and I'm truly sorry. I know an apology doesn't erase what I did, but I'm committed to learning from this and making changes." The HR representative scribbled notes on a clipboard while Evelyn exchanged a glance with him. Sheila's heart sank further. She could sense that while her words were sincere, they might not be enough to undo the damage she had caused. Evelyn leaned back, her expression still stern. "Sheila, your years of service with Ambrosia Airways have been exemplary, until now. But this incident is not something we can overlook. The Bells have every right to expect fair treatment, and their experience reflects poorly on the airline. This isn't just about you, it's about the culture we want to foster." Sheila nodded, feeling the sting of tears she refused to let fall. For so long, she had prided herself on her professionalism, but now it felt like little more than a shield she had used to hide from her own flaws. "We will review this matter thoroughly before making a final decision," Evelyn said. "For now, you are suspended with pay pending the outcome," Evelyn concluded, her tone final. "You'll be notified of our decision within the week." Sheila thanked them quietly, her voice barely audible, as she left the conference room. The weight of the suspension pressed down on her, a suffocating reminder that her career hung in the balance. But more than that, she was beginning to understand that her life as she had known it would never be the same. The days following Sheila's suspension felt endless. Her usual routine, waking early, putting on her crisp uniform, and stepping onto the plane with a sense of purpose, was gone, leaving behind an empty void. Each day stretched unbearably as she waited for an update from Ambrosia Airways' corporate office. She replayed the events of the flight over and over in her mind, scrutinizing every interaction, every decision. She searched desperately for a single moment she could have changed to prevent the downward spiral. But no matter how much she analyzed it, the answer remained the same. It wasn't one moment. It was every choice she had made, every bias she had allowed to influence her actions. Her phone became both a lifeline and a tormentor. Every buzz made her heart leap with hope, only to sink when the notification wasn't from the airline. The silence from corporate was unbearable, a constant reminder of the uncertainty hanging over her future. She avoided calls from friends and family, unwilling to admit why she wasn't working. The shame of her suspension kept her isolated, trapped with her thoughts. On the third day, an unexpected email broke the monotony. It wasn't from HR or corporate. It was from a coworker, Dana. The subject line read, "Are you okay?" Sheila hesitated before opening it, unsure if she was ready to hear from anyone connected to that flight. The email was brief but sincere. "Hi Sheila, I just wanted to check in. I know things got tense on the flight and I heard about your suspension. I hope you're holding up okay. Let me know if you want to talk." Sheila stared at the screen, her emotions conflicted. Dana had been the closest witness to what had happened, and while she hadn't said much during the flight, Sheila could tell she had disapproved. Even so, the email felt genuine, and for the first time in days, Sheila felt a faint spark of connection. She typed a quick reply. "Thanks for checking in. It's been a rough week. Maybe we can talk soon." She hit send and set the phone down, realizing how profoundly lonely she had felt. The walls of her apartment seemed to close in around her, the weight of her suspension pressing heavier with each passing moment. That evening, Sheila decided to leave her apartment for the first time since her suspension. She needed air, space, something to distract her from the oppressive silence. Wandering aimlessly through the city, she eventually stumbled upon a quiet coffee shop tucked away from the bustling streets. She ordered a drink and chose a seat in the corner, hoping the ambient chatter and clinking of cups would drown out her thoughts. As she sipped her coffee, her mind drifted back to the bells. She thought about their calm, unshakable composure during the flight and the quiet strength they had displayed in the lounge. Alana's sharp, measured words echoed in her mind. "What have you learned in 15 years?" Sheila hadn't had an answer then, and she wasn't sure she had one now. Her gaze fell on a group of young professionals seated nearby. Their laughter and easy conversation were a stark contrast to her own turmoil. For a fleeting moment, she envied their carefree demeanor. But then, one of their comments caught her attention. "I read about the Ambrosia thing," a woman said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "The owners were on a flight, and the crew totally screwed up. Can you imagine?" Sheila froze, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. Another person at the nearby table chimed in. "Yeah, I saw something about it online. Apparently the owners are this super successful black couple, and the staff didn't know who they were. Pretty embarrassing for the airline." The woman who had started the conversation shook her head, laughing softly. "Talk about karma. You can't treat people like that and expect it not to come back around." Sheila felt her stomach twist. She hadn't realized how far the story had spread. Hearing it discussed by strangers made it feel more real, more inescapable. She set her coffee cup down, her appetite gone, and stared blankly at the table. Her thoughts churned. If people were already talking about the incident, what would happen if she lost her job? Would her name become part of the narrative? The idea of being publicly associated with such a failure sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. Sheila left the coffee shop in a daze, the stranger's conversation playing on repeat in her mind. For the first time, she realized she wasn't just fighting for her career anymore. She was fighting to preserve the identity she had built for herself. But a gnawing question surfaced. Was that identity even worth holding on to? The following morning, Sheila woke to an email from Ambrosia Airways. Her breath hitched as she opened it, her hands trembling. The subject line read, "Decision regarding suspension, Sheila Carter." Her stomach churned as she scanned the message quickly, heart pounding. The first few lines confirmed her worst fears. "Dear Miss Carter, following a thorough review of the incident on Flight 207 and consultation with the airline's leadership team, including our stakeholders, we have reached a decision regarding your employment with Ambrosia Airways." Sheila's eyes skimmed down the page, clinging to a shred of hope. But then the word struck her like a blow. Your employment with Ambrosia Airways will be terminated effective immediately. She reread the line over and over, as though the words might change if she stared at them long enough. But they didn't. The email continued, detailing the reasons for the decision: violations of company policies regarding inclusivity, failure to uphold the airline's standards, and the potential damage to its reputation. It concluded with instructions about her severance package and returning her uniform and credentials. Sheila dropped the phone onto the table, her hands trembling. It was done. The career she had spent 15 years building was gone in an instant. She sat in stunned silence as the enormity of it washed over her. The fear of this moment had consumed her for days, but now that it had arrived, it didn't feel real. It felt as though the ground beneath her had vanished, leaving her suspended in a void. Her first instinct was to call someone, anyone. But she hesitated. Who would understand? Her coworkers would see her as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what could happen if they crossed the line. Her family might be supportive, but they wouldn't grasp the full weight of what this meant to her. And she didn't have many friends outside of work. Her life had revolved around Ambrosia Airways for so long that it was hard to imagine anything else. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. This was her doing. She knew that. But the weight of accountability felt unbearable. What now? How could she move forward when her entire identity was tied to the career she had just lost? Sheila stood abruptly, pacing her small apartment as though the motion could release the growing tension in her chest. The walls felt like they were closing in again, the silence growing louder with every passing moment. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. How would she rebuild? Could she? And perhaps the hardest question of all, had she truly learned anything from this? Or was this just another failure she would carry with her forever? On the 5th day, her doorbell rang. Startled, Sheila hesitated before peeking through the peephole. It was Dana. Sheila froze, unsure if she wanted to see anyone. Eventually, she opened the door. Dana gave her a tentative smile. "Hey," she said softly. "I know you've been going through a lot, so I brought you something." She held up a paper bag with the logo of a local bakery stamped on the side. "It's not much, but I figured you could use something sweet." Sheila stepped aside, letting Dana in. "Thanks," she murmured, her voice hoarse from days of disuse. They sat at Sheila's small kitchen table, the bakery bag between them. Dana broke the silence first. "I heard about the termination," she said gently. "I'm really sorry, Sheila. I know this must be a lot to handle." Sheila exhaled shakily, her hands fidgeting with the edge of the table. "It's not like I didn't see it coming," she said quietly. "I made my choices and now I'm paying for them." Dana nodded, her expression filled with compassion. "I get that," she said, "but you're not the only one who's ever made a mistake. You just ended up in a situation where it was impossible to hide from the consequences." Sheila looked up, her eyes searching Dana's face. "Do you think I'm a bad person?" she asked suddenly, her voice cracking. "Because of what I did?" Dana paused, considering her words carefully. "I don't think you're a bad person, Sheila," she said. "I think you've been carrying biases you didn't even realize you had. And when they were challenged, you acted in a way that hurt people. But recognizing that, that's the first step toward being better." Sheila blinked, her throat tightening. "What if it's too late?" she whispered. "What if I've ruined everything?" "It's not too late," Dana said firmly. "You lost your job, yes, but you didn't lose your ability to learn, to grow, to change. The question is, are you willing to do the hard work to make that happen?" The words hung in the air, heavy but not crushing. For the first time since her termination, Sheila felt a faint flicker of hope. Not because her situation had magically resolved, but because she realized she still had a choice. The road ahead was uncertain and full of challenges, but perhaps this wasn't the end. Maybe it was the beginning of something different. Something better. She just didn't know what it looked like yet. Sheila sat at the table long after Dana had left, the bakery bag untouched beside her. The quiet advice Dana had given echoed in her mind, challenging her to step out of the fog she had been drowning in. "Are you willing to do the hard work?" It was a simple question, but the answer felt monumental. Could she truly confront the person she had been and find a way forward? The idea of change terrified her. For years, she had built her identity around being a professional, confident, composed, untouchable. But the cracks in that identity, so brutally exposed by the bells, left her unsure of who she was without it. Yet, what terrified her more was the thought of staying the same, of letting this moment define her as the woman who failed and never tried to fix it. For the first time in days, Sheila turned on her laptop. She stared at the blank search bar, unsure where to begin. Slowly she started typing, unconscious bias and discrimination in the workplace. The search results filled Sheila's screen, articles, studies, training programs, and personal essays. She clicked on one, then another, and soon she was immersed in stories of people who had recognized their own biases and worked to overcome them. Each story was unique, but a common thread wove them together. Change wasn't easy, but it was possible. Sheila found herself scrolling through forums and discussion boards, reading candid accounts from people of all walks of life. Some were confronting their own biases, while others shared the pain of being on the receiving end of discrimination. One post in particular caught her attention. It was written by a woman who had faced prejudice in her career and decided to turn her experience into a force for good. The woman had founded an organization dedicated to fostering inclusivity and accountability in workplaces. The words resonated deeply with Sheila. She thought about Alana Bell sitting across from her in the lounge, asking the question that still haunted her. What have you learned in 15 years? Sheila realized she hadn't had a good answer then, but maybe, just maybe, she could start finding one now. She bookmarked several articles and training resources, her fingers trembling slightly as she worked. For the first time, she considered reaching out to a professional organization for help, something she would have scoffed at in the past. But now, the idea of learning from others felt less like a concession and more like a necessary step forward. Sheila wasn't naive. She knew this wasn't a quick fix. Undoing years of ingrained attitudes and behaviors would take time, effort, and humility. But the alternative, remaining the person who had failed so profoundly, was no longer acceptable. The next morning, Sheila woke with a strange mix of dread and determination. The weight of her situation hadn't lifted, but for the first time she had a sense of direction. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone. She knew what she needed to do. Her finger hovered over the contact list before she found the number she had saved years ago, her younger sister, Lena. Sheila and Lena hadn't spoken in months. Their relationship had become strained over time, largely due to Sheila's rigid and often dismissive attitude. For years, she had pushed people away, convinced she didn't need anyone else. But now, she realized how wrong she had been. If she was going to start this journey toward change, she needed to rebuild, not just her career, but her connections, starting with the people she had shut out. With a deep breath, Sheila pressed the call button. As the phone rang, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this call wouldn't fix everything, but it could be the first step toward something better.